The wind was a blade of ice, carving through the thin walls of the cabin, finding every crack and seam. Alara huddled deeper into the tattered blanket, the cold a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Outside, the late autumn storm raged, a fitting shroud for the despair that had settled over her like the coming snow. 3 weeks alone. 3 weeks since the fever took her father, leaving her in this desolate place with nothing but a few provisions and the gnawing fear of what lay beyond the tree line. That fear had a name, the Hargrove brothers. They'd come the day after the burial, their faces hard as frost-bitten earth, their eyes cold with calculated purpose. They claimed the land was theirs, a debt her father supposedly owed, a debt that somehow transferred to the cabin, the small plot of tilled soil, everything. Alara knew it was a lie. Her father had spoken of them with wary contempt, but never of debt. They were circling now like wolves, waiting for her to break, for hunger or fear to drive her out into the storm so they could simply take. She was 18, alone, and the world felt vast and unforgivably cruel. A sudden gust rattled the window pane violently, sounding like a fist. Alara flinched, her heart hammered against her ribs. She strained her ears over the shriek of the wind. Was that a different sound? A groan of stressed wood? She crept to the window, peering out through the grimy glass. Snow swirled, thick and blinding. Then, a dark shape against the white canvas of the blizzard. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, struggling with something near the old half-collapsed lean-to where her father had kept a single, long-gone horse. He was wrestling with canvas, trying to erect some kind of makeshift shelter against the side of the structure. He moved with a quiet, almost methodical economy of motion despite the wind tearing at him. Not one of the Hargroves. They were stocky, loud, their movements rough and impatient. This man was different, an outsider, another variable in her desperate equation. Fear warred with a flicker of desperate, irrational hope. Who was he? Why was he here, in the middle of nowhere in this storm? He finally secured the canvas, a low, sloping roof offering scant protection. He ducked underneath, disappearing from view. Alara remained by the window, watching the dark shape of the lean-to, the unknown presence so close. Was he a threat? A bandit? Just another soul lost and seeking refuge? The isolation had become so profound it felt like a physical ache. Yet the thought of sharing this fragile space, this last vestige of her life, with a stranger filled her with dread. He hadn't approached the cabin, just sought his own meager shelter. It was something. Not help, not salvation, but not immediate hostility either. She retreated from the window, back to the cold hearth. The last few scraps of wood were burning low, casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin seem vast and full of unseen things. She needed more wood, but going out in this storm, and with him out there, it was a new layer of paralysis added to the old. Her stomach clenched with emptiness. Hunger gnawed at her, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She closed her eyes, picturing her father's kind face, hearing his quiet strength. Felt like a lifetime ago. She was alone, completely, terrifyingly alone. The storm howled, a relentless, mournful sound, echoing the tempest in her soul. She sank to the floor, the rough wood cold against her cheek, the weight of her situation crushing. But beneath the despair, a tiny ember of defiance glowed. She would not be driven out. Not yet. He was still there in the morning. The storm had abated, leaving behind a world muffled in white. A thin trail of smoke curled from the lean-to. Alara watched it through the window, a strange mixture of apprehension and reluctant curiosity stirring within her. He emerged eventually, a tall figure moving stiffly in the cold air. He was dressed in worn, practical clothes, a long, dark coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He had a quiet presence, like a shadow that had decided to stay a while. He busied himself with some minor adjustments to his makeshift shelter, his movements deliberate and efficient. He glanced towards the cabin once, but his hat obscured his face, and he made no move towards her door. Alara spent the day in a state of tense observation. She needed water from the well, wood for the fire. Simple tasks that now felt fraught with danger because of the man outside. Hunger was a persistent ache. By midday, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Clutching a small axe, more for comfort than actual defense, she opened the cabin door, the cold air hitting her like a physical blow. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, moving towards the woodpile near the edge of the clearing. As she worked, the rhythmic thud of the axe against frozen wood echoing in the quiet landscape. She was acutely aware of his presence. He was sitting by the lean-to now, whittling a piece of wood, his stillness unnerving. He didn't look at her directly, but she felt his eyes upon her. It was not a leering gaze, but one of quiet, steady observation. It unnerved her more than overt hostility might have. She chopped wood until her arms ached, her lungs burned, and the small pile grew. When she straightened up, finally allowing herself to look towards him, he was standing. He walked towards her then, slowly, deliberately. Alara's hand tightened on the axe handle. He stopped a few yards away, his expression unreadable in the shadow of his hat. He didn't speak. He simply gestured with his chin towards the well. Then he walked past her, picked up the heavy bucket by the well head, and began to lower it. The message was clear if unspoken. He was helping, or perhaps simply doing what needed to be done in a place where survival depended on such things. Alara hesitated, then followed him. They worked in silence, him drawing the water, she carrying the heavy buckets back to the cabin, their steps crunching on the snow. Later, as dusk began to paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of blue and gray, he approached the cabin again. He carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He stopped at the door and knocked, a firm, quiet rap. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. She opened the door a crack. He held out the bundle. "Rabbit?" he said, his voice low, a rumble that seemed to match the quiet depth of his presence. "Caught it this morning." He didn't wait for thanks, didn't ask to come in. He simply placed the bundle on the step and turned, walking back towards his lean-to. Alara stared at the bundle, then at his retreating back. A knot in her chest began to loosen, just slightly. He was not one of them. He was not here to take. He was providing. It was a small act, but in her world of scarcity and threat, it felt monumental. She brought the rabbit inside, her hands trembling slightly. As she prepared the meager meal, a single question echoed in her mind. Who was he, and why was he here? The Hargroves hadn't shown themselves since the storm, but she knew they were still watching. His presence felt like a fragile shield, temporary but real. For the first time in weeks, she ate a warm meal, and the simple act felt like a small victory against the relentless cold and the ever-present fear. Trust was a dangerous thing, a luxury she could not afford, but this silent, capable stranger was chipping away at her defenses with quiet acts of unexpected consideration. Days bled into a week. The routine solidified, a strange, silent partnership born of necessity. Alara tended to the cabin, venturing out for water and wood. The man, Silas, as he introduced himself one day in a brief, unprompted utterance, hunted, checked snares, and seemed to melt into the landscape itself. He didn't intrude on her space, didn't ask questions. His presence was a quiet anchor in her volatile world. He would leave small offerings by the door, a skinned rabbit, a few plucked fowl, once a handful of late-season berries he'd found. Alara, in turn, would leave out a portion of the stew she made or fresh water she'd drawn. Words remained sparse, almost non-existent, but a silent understanding began to grow between them. Alara watched him. She saw the way he moved, quick and silent, the way his eyes constantly scanned the treeline. She saw the tension in his shoulders even at rest. He was wary, watchful, like a hunted animal. It mirrored her own internal state. One evening, as she sat by the fire, her internal monologue a constant low hum of fear and vigilance, she saw him silhouetted against the moonlight through the window. He wasn't just watching the woods. He was watching the path that led from the Hargrove place. He knew they were a threat. She started leaving the cabin door slightly ajar when she went out, a silent acknowledgement of his presence, a tentative offering of trust. He never came in without knocking, and then only to leave something by the door. But the space between them seemed to shrink. One biting cold afternoon, she was struggling with a particularly stubborn log. Silas emerged from the woods, his steps making little sound on the frozen ground. He didn't say a word. He simply took the axe from her hand and, with a few powerful, expert swings, split the log cleanly in two. He stacked the pieces neatly for her before handing the axe back, his gaze meeting hers briefly. His eyes were a clear, steady gray, intelligent and tired. In that moment, unspoken, something shifted. It was Silas who found the first sign. He brought her a small, crudely made wooden box. "Near the old boundary stone," he said, his voice low. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a small, tarnished silver locket. Alara recognized it instantly. It belonged to her mother. Her mother, who had disappeared years ago, swallowed by the world beyond their valley, never spoken of again by her father with anything but pain. "The Hargroves," Silas continued, his voice grim, "they buried it, like they were burying something else." A chill, colder than the mountain air, snaked down Alara's spine. Why would they bury her mother's locket? What were they trying to hide? Silas watched her, his gaze steady. "Your father. Was he looking for something? Before he got sick?" Alara thought back. Her father had been preoccupied in the months before, often poring over old maps, muttering about claims and markers. He'd been more guarded than usual. He was troubled, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "About the land. About old papers." Silas nodded slowly. "They're not just after the cabin, Alara. There's something else." His use of her name felt significant, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared plight. The vague threat of the Hargroves solidified into something more sinister, something rooted in the past, connected to her mother, to secrets buried literally and figuratively. Fear was still present, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mixed with a fierce, protective anger for her father, for her lost mother, and for the home the Hargroves sought to steal. Silas's presence no longer felt just like a shield, but like a potential ally. The slow burn of their connection had reached a crucial point. They were in this together now. The Hargroves came 3 days later. Not the blustering, demanding visit this time, but under the cover of pre-dawn darkness. Alara was awake, the locket heavy in her hand, the weight of Silas's unspoken revelations pressing down on her. She heard the crunch of snow, too heavy for an animal, too deliberate for the wind. She slipped from her bunk, moving silently to the window. 3 figures, moving with a stealth that belied their usual rough manner. They were heading not for the cabin door, but towards the rear, where the old root cellar was dug into the earth. She saw Silas emerge from the shadows near his lean-to, a silent wraith in the gloom. He moved parallel to the Hargroves, keeping to the deeper shadows at the edge of the clearing. Alara's heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. She wanted to cry out, to warn him, but her throat was locked with fear. She saw one of the Hargroves, the largest, Miller, kneel by the cellar door. Another, Jedediah, held a lantern, its light casting dancing, grotesque shadows. The third, Caleb, stood guard, his rifle held ready. Silas moved with a purpose Alara hadn't seen before, utterly focused, utterly lethal in his quiet intent. He circled wider, approaching the cellar from the opposite side. He seemed to anticipate their every move. As Miller fumbled with the old lock on the cellar door, Silas made his move. He came up behind Caleb, a silent blur. There was a brief, sharp struggle quickly stifled. Alara saw Caleb crumple. Jedediah spun around, raising the lantern, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. Silas was already moving towards him. The lantern dropped and shattered, plunging the immediate area into deeper shadow, broken only by the pale moonlight. Alara heard a grunt, a thud. Silence. Miller, still at the cellar door, stood up, drawing a pistol. "Jed? Caleb?" he called out, his voice thick with apprehension. Silas emerged from the darkness, silent, implacable. Miller fired, the shot echoing violently in the stillness. Alara flinched, but Silas seemed to absorb the sound. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between them, a dark force against the snow. There was a struggle, brief, brutal. Alara heard the clang of metal, a choked cry, then silence again. Complete, unnerving silence. Alara remained frozen by the window, straining to see. The moonlight was weak, but she could make out Silas standing over the shapes on the ground. He was still for a long moment, assessing. Then he moved towards the cellar door. He didn't try the lock, but examined the ground near it, scraping away snow. He found something, a loose stone, a concealed latch. He knelt and worked for a moment, his movements economical. He pulled something from the earth beneath the stone. It glinted dully in the faint light. A metal box. He didn't open it there. He came towards the cabin, his steps heavy now. He knocked, the sound echoing unnaturally after the violence. Alara stumbled to the door and opened it. His face was grim, streaked with dirt and something dark. He held out the metal box. "They were digging tonight," he said, his voice rough. "For this." Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, were papers. Deeds signed and notarized dating back decades. And amongst them, tucked into a small envelope, was a recent letter. Alara read it, her hands shaking. It was from her mother, sent just months ago to her father. It spoke of her return, of reclaiming what was hers, the land. Yes, but also something hidden on it. Something valuable her family had known about for generations. The Hargroves had stolen the original deeds years ago, trying to claim the land legally, but they hadn't known about this hidden something. Her father, it seemed, had been trying to prove their fraud and locate this hidden asset before his death. The Hargroves, perhaps suspecting her father was close, had upped their pressure, burying her mother's locket to make her think her mother was truly gone, never returning, severing that last thread of hope or inquiry. They planned to take the land by force, dig it up, and be gone before anyone was the wiser. Alara looked from the papers, proof of her family's rightful claim, to Silas, standing silent and watchful in her doorway. He hadn't saved her from poverty. He had saved her from a far more calculated, desperate evil. He hadn't simply stumbled onto her land. He had been here, perhaps watching the Hargroves, perhaps drawn by the same rumors her father had been chasing. He was an outsider, yes, but one who had seen the truth of her situation and acted. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. He simply nodded. "They won't be back," he stated, stating fact, not promise. He hadn't asked about what was in the box, though he knew its significance. The immediate threat was gone, dealt with by Silas's swift, brutal efficiency. But the silence that settled after was heavy, filled with the weight of death and unearthed secrets. Alara looked at the dawn breaking over the snow-covered peaks, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. It was a beautiful, indifferent world. She was still alone in a sense, but not solitary. Silas was there, a quiet, solid presence. He didn't leave. He stayed, fixing the lean-to properly, repairing the fence the Hargroves had cut, helping Alara secure the cabin for the harsh winter that was setting in. They still spoke little, their communication existing more in shared tasks, quiet observations, and mutual respect that had been forged in fear and necessity. Alara felt the shift within her. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it no longer controlled her. It was tempered by a hard, resilient strength, born of surviving loss, standing against evil, and finding unexpected alliance in the most desolate of circumstances. She had been vulnerable, broken, but she was rebuilding piece by painstaking piece. The dark secrets of the Hargroves were buried again, not in the earth, but in the quiet understanding between Alara and Silas. The land was hers, the truth of her parents' history clearer, though still tinged with sorrow and mystery. The future remained uncertain, but as Alara watched Silas mend a broken shutter, his movements steady and capable, a quiet sense of hope, fragile but persistent, bloomed in her chest. They were two solitary souls in a harsh world, but they faced it together now, side by side, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and quiet, unspoken trust. Resilience was not the absence of fear, she realized, but the strength to stand against it, with dignity and quiet determination, and sometimes with an unexpected ally who emerged from the storm.